The Christmas message that changed everything fit on a single screen. 7 words. 7 polite, careful words that somehow hurt more than any argument ever could. I was standing in my kitchen on a cold December afternoon, wrapping the last of the presents I had bought for my family, when my phone buzzed on the counter. The tree lights reflected softly against the window. A pot of cinnamon cider simmered on the stove. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly the way Christmas was supposed to feel. Then I picked up my phone and read the text from my younger sister, Linda. Maybe you should skip Christmas this year. I stared at the message, certain I had misunderstood it. I read it again, then again. The words did not change. Neither did the knot forming in my chest. At 71 years old, I thought I had learned how to handle disappointment. Life teaches you that eventually, you lose people, you lose plans, you lose the future you imagined. But there was something uniquely painful about being excluded from your own family's Christmas gathering through a text message. Not a phone call, not a conversation, just a few words sent between errands, as if my absence were a scheduling detail rather than a person's heart. I set my phone down and looked around the kitchen. On the table sat neatly wrapped gifts with handwritten tags. One for Linda, one for my niece Madison, one for each member of the family. I had spent weeks preparing. I always did. Christmas had been my favorite holiday for as long as I could remember. Even after my husband passed away 8 years earlier, I kept the traditions alive. The cookies, the decorations, the family recipes, the matching stockings. I believe traditions mattered because they reminded people where they belonged. Apparently, I was the only one who still believed that. A few minutes later, another message appeared. It's probably best for everyone. We just want a quiet holiday this year. Quiet. The word lingered in my mind. Family gatherings at Linda's house were never quiet. They were crowded and noisy and full of laughter. Someone was always talking too loudly. Someone was always arguing about football. Children ran through the living room. Quiet had never been the goal. So why was it suddenly important now? I sat down at the kitchen table and read both messages again. The more I looked at them, the less they felt spontaneous. Every word seemed carefully chosen. Polite enough to avoid confrontation. Cold enough to keep me away. I wanted to call Linda immediately. I wanted to ask her what had happened. Instead, I remained still. Age teaches you something else besides patience. It teaches you that the first explanation is rarely the true one. I watched the steam rise from my mug of coffee. Outside, a light snowfall had begun to cover the street. Across the road, a family was decorating their porch with red ribbons and lights. Everything looked normal, yet something felt wrong, deeply wrong. My phone remained silent for the rest of the afternoon. No apology arrived. No clarification. No call from Madison. No message from anyone else. Hours passed. The Christmas music playing softly in the background suddenly sounded distant. I looked at the gifts once more. Then I looked at the text. Somewhere behind those 7 words was a story nobody was telling me. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether this Christmas invitation had been canceled long before the message was ever sent. Christmas Eve arrived with a silence that felt heavier than snow. I woke up before sunrise, the way I always did on holidays, and for a few seconds I forgot everything. Then I looked at my phone on the nightstand and remembered the messages from Linda. The house was still. No notifications. No missed calls. No one checking to see how I was doing. I got out of bed and walked to the living room. The tree stood in the corner, glowing softly in the darkness. Beneath it sat the presents I had wrapped for my family. Bright paper, careful bows, small handwritten tags. They looked exactly as they had the night before. Untouched. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. Across the neighborhood, people were already moving around. Cars pulled into driveways. Children carried packages inside houses. Christmas was happening everywhere except here. I told myself I was not going to spend the day feeling sorry for myself. I had survived harder things than a disappointing holiday. I had buried a husband. I had rebuilt a life afterward. A single text message should not have had this much power over me. Yet every time I tried to focus on something else, the same question returned. Why? Linda and I had never been especially close, but we had always shown up for family events. Birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas. We were different people, but we were still family. At least that was what I had believed. Around noon, I opened an old photo album. I had not looked through it in years. There was a picture of Linda and me sitting on Santa's lap when I was 10 and she was 6. Another showed us decorating cookies in our mother's kitchen. There was even one from Madison's first Christmas, when she was wrapped in a red blanket and sleeping in my arms. I remembered buying her first bicycle. I remembered helping pay for summer programs when money was tight. I remembered every school recital I attended. Looking at those photographs, I realized something unsettling. Most of my favorite memories involved me showing up for other people. Very few involved them showing up for me. The thought stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, while heating leftovers for dinner, I found myself remembering other moments I had ignored over the years. A graduation party where I learned about the event only after seeing pictures online. A family barbecue that was apparently organized after everyone assumed I was too busy to attend. A birthday dinner where my seat had somehow been forgotten. Each incident had seemed small at the time. Each one had a reasonable explanation. Life was busy. Plans changed. Mistakes happened. But viewed together, they formed a pattern I could no longer dismiss. I carried my plate to the table and sat alone. The empty chair across from me caught my attention. It used to belong to my husband. For years after he passed away, I kept expecting family ties to grow stronger. Instead, they seemed to weaken. As the evening grew darker, I glanced once more at my phone. Still nothing. No holiday greeting. No explanation. No attempt to make things right. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether being excluded from this Christmas was not an exception at all. Maybe it was simply the first time someone had finally said the quiet part out loud. The day after Christmas, I did something I had not done in years. I opened Facebook before breakfast. Normally, I avoided spending much time there. It often felt like a place where people displayed polished versions of their lives while hiding everything that mattered. But that morning, curiosity got the better of me. Within seconds, I found what I was looking for. Photos from Linda's Christmas gathering filled my screen. There was the dining room table covered in holiday decorations. There was Madison smiling beside the tree. There were cousins, neighbors, friends, and relatives I had known for decades. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone seemed welcome. Everyone except me. I scrolled slowly through the pictures. One after another, I was surprised by how calm I felt. The hurt was still there, but it had settled into something quieter, something colder. I was no longer searching for an explanation. I was searching for the truth. Then I noticed something unusual. In one photo, Madison was standing near the fireplace holding a mug of hot chocolate. Behind her, partially visible on a side table, was a framed seating chart. At first it looked unimportant, just another party detail. But something about it caught my attention. I enlarged the image. The quality became blurry, yet I could still make out several names. Family members, guests, assigned seating arrangements. My eyes moved down the list. I looked once, then again. My name was not there, not crossed out, not removed at the last minute. It was simply absent. The realization settled heavily over me. This had not been a last-minute decision. They had planned the event without me from the beginning. The text message had merely informed me of a decision already made. I set my phone down and stared out the kitchen window. Snow covered the backyard in a smooth white blanket. Everything looked peaceful, yet my thoughts kept returning to that seating chart. People rarely understand how much information small details reveal. A forgotten comment, a missing invitation, a photograph posted without thinking. Sometimes the truth appears in the background while everyone is focused on the foreground. Later that afternoon, I drove to visit my friend Helen Foster. We had known each other for more than 30 years. She poured coffee into 2 large mugs and listened quietly while I explained what had happened. She never interrupted. When I finally finished, she looked at me carefully. "Dorothy," she said, "how long has this been going on?" The question surprised me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Helen folded her hands. "I mean the pattern, not Christmas. Everything." I did not answer immediately. Instead, I thought about the graduation party, the forgotten birthday dinner, the barbecue, the growing distance after my husband died. Helen nodded as if she already knew what conclusion I was reaching. "People do not usually start excluding someone overnight," she said softly. "Most of the time it happens little by little." On the drive home, her words stayed with me. Little by little, mile after mile, memory after memory, I began seeing the past differently. The exclusion had not started with a holiday gathering. Christmas was simply the moment I finally stopped explaining away what I had been seeing for years. And the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was still something important I did not know. Over the next few days, I stopped looking for emotional answers and started looking for practical ones. Grief, disappointment, and confusion can cloud judgment. Facts rarely do. One rainy afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened a filing cabinet that had not been organized in years. Inside were folders containing tax records, receipts, bank statements, scholarship documents, and correspondence I had accumulated over time. I was not searching for anything specific at first. I simply wanted to understand my own financial history. Madison's college expenses quickly caught my attention. 6 years earlier, when she was preparing for college, I had volunteered to help. Education mattered to me. My parents had struggled financially when I was young, and I never forgot how difficult it was to build a future without support. Helping Madison had felt meaningful. It felt like investing in family. I pulled out one folder after another. Tuition payments, housing assistance, textbook reimbursements, semester deposits. The stack grew larger beside me. I had never paid much attention to the total amount because I trusted Linda. Whenever there was an expense, she would call. Whenever paperwork needed attention, she would handle it. I rarely questioned anything. Family relationships are often built on trust more than verification. As the afternoon passed, I began creating a simple spreadsheet on my laptop. Dates, amounts, destinations, notes. By evening, a pattern started to emerge. Several payments were larger than expected. Some requests appeared unusually urgent. Others lacked supporting documentation entirely. None of the individual transactions seemed alarming on their own. Yet together they raised questions I had never asked before. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the house remained quiet. The silence gave me room to think. What bothered me most was not the money itself. It was the realization that I had stopped paying attention years ago. I had trusted the story being presented to me because I wanted to believe it. The next morning, I called the university's financial services office. I expected a routine conversation. Instead, the representative politely informed me that certain billing arrangements differed from what I remembered. There was nothing inappropriate about the information she provided. In fact, everything appeared completely legitimate. Yet several details did not match the explanations I had received over the years. After hanging up, I sat motionless for several minutes. The feeling was difficult to describe. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something closer to awakening, like entering a familiar room and suddenly noticing furniture had been moved months earlier. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That evening, I revisited old emails and text messages. Many conversations seemed ordinary at first glance, but viewed through a different lens, they revealed something else. Repeated urgency, repeated pressure, repeated reminders about financial deadlines. Whenever assistance was needed, communication arrived immediately. Whenever family gatherings were planned, communication often arrived late or not at all. The contrast was impossible to ignore. By midnight, my desk was covered with papers. Numbers filled my spreadsheet. Notes covered several pages. I was not ready to draw conclusions. Responsible people do not accuse others based on suspicion alone. But for the first time, I understood that the answers I was seeking would not be found in holiday photographs or polite text messages. They were hidden somewhere inside years of financial records, and the deeper I looked, the more I began to suspect that I had only uncovered the first layer of a much larger story. 2 days later, an answer arrived from a place I never expected. I was grocery shopping when I ran into Carol Jensen, a woman I had known for years through community events and local fundraisers. Carol was friendly, observant, and the sort of person who remembered details most people overlooked. We exchanged a few pleasantries near the produce section before she smiled and asked how Madison was doing at school. The question seemed innocent enough. I told her I assumed everything was going well. Carol nodded. "She is lucky to have so much support," she said. I thanked her and prepared to move on, but then she added something that stopped me. "Not many grandparents would do what you have done." Grandparents. The word caught my attention immediately. Madison was my niece, not my granddaughter. I gently corrected her. Carol looked confused. "Really?" she asked. "I thought Linda told everyone you were managing a family education fund for the next generation." I smiled politely, but my mind was already racing. After we said goodbye, I sat in my car for nearly 15 minutes thinking about that conversation. Education fund. The next generation. The phrase sounded familiar. That evening, I began searching through older correspondence. Emails, holiday letters, fundraising invitations, family updates. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. Several years earlier, Linda had circulated a message to extended relatives discussing educational opportunities for Madison. The wording was subtle, but something stood out. The financial support was described as coming from a broader family arrangement rather than from me personally. At the time, I had not cared. Recognition was never important to me. Yet viewed alongside everything else, the detail felt significant. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to old conversations. Little remarks that once seemed harmless now carried different meaning. I remembered family members thanking Linda for her sacrifices. I remembered people praising her dedication to Madison's future. Rarely did anyone mention my involvement. At first, I wondered whether that was simply how memories worked. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive. Then another memory surfaced. About a year earlier, during a family gathering, someone had congratulated Linda for ensuring Madison graduated without financial stress. Linda had smiled and accepted the compliment without correction. I remembered standing nearby holding a plate of food. At the time, I said nothing. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet now it returned with remarkable clarity. Not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. Silence can reveal as much as speech. The more I reflected, the more I began to understand something uncomfortable. My role had gradually become invisible, not erased entirely, just softened around the edges until it blended into the background. I continued providing support. I continued answering requests. I continued trusting the explanations I received. Meanwhile, the narrative presented to others seemed increasingly different from reality. One evening, while reviewing additional records, I noticed another unusual detail. Several requests for financial assistance had arrived shortly after periods when communication from Linda had been almost non-existent. Weeks of silence would suddenly be interrupted by urgent discussions about tuition, housing costs, or educational expenses. Once the need was met, the silence often returned. I stared at the timeline on my screen. The pattern was difficult to ignore. For years, I had interpreted those gaps as ordinary life. People got busy. Families drifted. Schedules changed. Now I saw something else. The relationship appeared strongest when money was involved and weakest when it was not. That realization did not make me angry. It made me sad, because for the first time, I found myself asking a question I had spent years avoiding. If financial support disappeared tomorrow, how much of this relationship would remain? The breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shocking confession, no sudden revelation delivered at my front door. Instead, it arrived through a casual conversation that almost never happened. I was attending a community luncheon at the local library when I ran into an acquaintance named Patricia. We knew each other well enough to exchange greetings, but not well enough to discuss personal matters. During our conversation, Madison's name came up. Patricia smiled and mentioned that she had seen Madison a few months earlier at a scholarship reception. That caught my attention because I had never heard about such an event. I asked a few polite questions. Patricia answered without hesitation. According to her, Madison had spoken proudly about her educational journey and thanked several people who had supported her. Nothing unusual there. Then Patricia repeated something she remembered hearing during a conversation afterward. "Your sister must be so relieved," she said. Madison told everyone her mother worked so hard to make college possible. Patricia meant no harm. She was simply sharing a memory. I thanked her and changed the subject. But on the drive home, her words stayed with me. Once again, I found myself facing the same uncomfortable pattern. The support I provided seemed to disappear whenever the story was being told publicly. That evening, I reviewed more correspondence. I was no longer searching for financial discrepancies. I was studying behavior, communication, timing, relationships. The picture becoming visible was far more revealing than any bank statement. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of an old family friend named George Reynolds. We had known each other for decades. After exchanging holiday greetings, our conversation drifted toward family matters. George hesitated several times before speaking. Finally, he said something that made me sit upright in my chair. "Dorothy, I have wanted to ask you something for years." His voice sounded cautious. "Why do you keep helping when they barely include you?" For a moment, I could not answer. George continued carefully. He explained that several times over the years he had overheard comments during gatherings. Nothing cruel, nothing dramatic, just remarks that left an impression. According to George, Linda often treated my financial support as something guaranteed, something expected, something permanent. One comment in particular stood out. He remembered Linda laughing during a conversation and saying, "As long as Dorothy keeps paying, everything works itself out." George apologized for repeating it. He worried it might upset me. Strangely, it did not. Instead, it brought clarity. The sentence fit too perfectly with everything I had been discovering. The delayed invitations, the disappearing recognition, the sudden communication whenever money was involved. For years, I had viewed myself as a valued member of the family, helping where I could. But sitting alone in my living room that evening, I finally confronted a different possibility. Perhaps I was no longer being treated like family at all. Perhaps I had slowly been reduced to a role, a resource, a solution to financial problems, a dependable source of support. The realization hurt, but it also simplified things. Confusion thrives when facts are missing. Clarity arrives when patterns become impossible to ignore. As I ended the call and looked around the quiet room, I understood that my next decision would not be based on anger. It would be based on truth. And for the first time since that Christmas message arrived, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The following Monday, I scheduled a meeting with Robert Collins. I had known Robert for years. He was not only a capable attorney, but also someone who understood the difference between an emotional decision and a necessary one. His office sat on the second floor of a brick building downtown, overlooking a small park where families often gathered on weekends. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a folder filled with documents, notes, and records I had spent weeks organizing. Robert greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. For a few moments we spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the holidays, retirement. Then I placed the folder on the table between us. "I need to understand my options," I said. Robert listened carefully as I explained everything. The exclusion from the family gathering, the financial records, the conversations, the growing realization that my support had become expected rather than appreciated. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. When I finished, he opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. The room remained quiet except for the sound of pages turning. After nearly half an hour, he closed the file and folded his hands. "Dorothy," he said calmly, "the first thing you need to know is that you are not obligated to continue any voluntary financial support arrangement." I nodded. Part of me already knew that, yet hearing the words spoken aloud carried a different weight. Robert continued, "Every contribution I had made had been my choice. Every payment had come from funds I controlled. There were no binding agreements requiring future support, no contracts, no legal obligations. The decision belonged entirely to me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked out the window toward the park below. Children were running across the grass while parents watched from nearby benches. Life continued, ordinary, uncomplicated. Meanwhile, I was sitting in an office reevaluating years of trust. "What would you do?" I finally asked. Robert smiled slightly. "My job is not to tell you what to do," he replied. "My job is to make sure you understand your choices." It was exactly the answer I expected from him. On the drive home, I thought about everything he had said. Surprisingly, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I had made a decision, because I finally understood that I had won. For years, I had behaved as though events were simply happening to me. Requests arrived. Payments were made. Expectations grew. I responded automatically because that was what I had always done. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that generosity is meaningful only when it remains a choice. That evening, I sat at my dining room table and reviewed the numbers one final time. The total amount I had contributed over the years was substantial, enough to help someone build a future, enough to demonstrate love, trust, and commitment. Yet as I studied the records, one question continued to return. If the financial support had never existed, would I still have been invited? Would I still have been included? Would I still have mattered? Deep down, I already knew the answer. Around 9 o'clock, I opened my laptop and drafted a short email requesting changes to the educational fund arrangement. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just clear instructions. I read the message twice before sending it. Then I sat quietly in the glow of the living room lamp. The moment felt strangely peaceful. No anger, no satisfaction, just certainty. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour. I listened as the final note faded into the night and realized that after weeks of searching for answers, I had finally reached a conclusion. The truth had not changed me. It had simply removed the illusion that had been standing in my way. The first call came 8 days later. I was watering the plants in my sunroom when my phone began ringing. Linda's name appeared on the screen. I watched it ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. Then another call came. Then another. By the end of the afternoon, there were 4 missed calls and 3 messages waiting for me. I listened to the first voicemail while standing beside the window. Linda sounded concerned. She said there seemed to be a problem with Madison's upcoming tuition payment. She assumed there had been some kind of administrative mistake. She asked me to call her back as soon as possible. The second message sounded less concerned and more urgent. The third sounded frustrated. I did not return any of them. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. I simply had nothing new to say. The decision had already been made. 2 days later, Madison called. Hearing her voice brought back memories of school concerts, birthday parties, and afternoons spent helping her with homework when she was younger. For a brief moment, I hoped the conversation might be different. Perhaps she wanted to talk about family. Perhaps she wanted to ask how I was doing. Instead, within a few minutes, the discussion returned to tuition deadlines and financial concerns. I listened quietly. Madison explained that she had been informed changes had been made to the funding arrangement. She sounded confused. She asked if there had been some misunderstanding. I told her there had been no misunderstanding. There was a long pause on the line. Then she asked why. The question lingered between us. For years I had imagined what I might say if this moment ever arrived. Yet when it finally happened, the answer felt surprisingly simple. I told her that support and relationships should never exist separately. I told her that generosity cannot survive indefinitely without respect. I told her that I hoped she would continue pursuing her education and building her future, but that I could no longer continue under the circumstances that had developed over the years. Madison did not argue. She mostly listened. When the conversation ended, I felt sadness rather than relief. Not because of the money, because somewhere along the way, meaningful conversations had been replaced by transactional ones. Over the following weeks, communication from Linda increased dramatically. Text messages arrived almost daily. Some were polite, others were defensive. A few attempted to revisit old family disagreements. None addressed the issue that mattered most. No one asked how it felt to be excluded. No one acknowledged the distance that had grown between us. No one discussed the years of being overlooked. The focus remained fixed on the consequences rather than the causes. That realization confirmed everything I had already learned. One evening, Helen stopped by with coffee and a box of pastries from a bakery. Downtown, we sat at my kitchen table while the winter sun disappeared beyond the trees outside. I updated her on everything that had happened. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. Interesting, she said. What is? I asked. Helen smiled gently. The moment they needed something, suddenly everyone knew how to find you. Her words stayed with me long after she left. Because they were true. For years I had worried about losing family connections. Yet now I could see something clearly. The people who genuinely cared about me had remained present even when they needed nothing at all. And the people who only appeared when support was required had revealed themselves without realizing it. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace with the choice I had made. Almost a year passed before I saw Linda in person again. By then, the sharp edges of the situation had softened. Not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I had stopped carrying it with me every day. Life has a way of moving forward when you allow it to. Spring arrived, then summer, then fall. I spent more time with friends. I joined a local book club. I traveled to visit places I had postponed seeing for years. Most importantly, I stopped organizing my life around people who had already decided where I belonged. When December returned, I noticed something surprising. For the first time in a long while, I was looking forward to the holidays. Not because I expected reconciliation, not because I expected apologies. I was looking forward to them because I finally felt free. A week before Christmas, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope belonged to Linda. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a short note. She wrote that the past year had been difficult. She admitted that mistakes had been made. She said she wished things had unfolded differently. The words were polite, careful, similar to the messages I had received the previous Christmas. Yet this time, something was different. There were no requests, no financial discussions, no deadlines, no mention of money at all. Just a simple invitation to meet for coffee if I was willing. I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then I continued with my day. A few days later, I agreed to meet her. We chose a small coffee shop downtown, the same place where retired couples often spent mornings talking over cinnamon rolls and hot coffee. When I arrived, Linda was already seated near the window. For a moment, she looked older than I remembered. Then I realized she was probably thinking the same thing about me. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Some topics were uncomfortable. Some remained unresolved. Yet for the first time in years, the conversation felt honest. There were no excuses large enough to erase the past. We both understood that. Trust does not return simply because people wish it would. It returns through actions, through consistency, through time. When we finally stood to leave, neither of us pretended everything had been fixed. But neither of us was pretending anymore. That mattered. Christmas Eve arrived a few days later. This time, I did not spend it alone. My dining room table was smaller than the gatherings I used to host, but somehow it felt warmer. Helen was there. George joined us. A few neighbors stopped by with desserts. Laughter filled the room. Stories were shared. Coffee cups were refilled. At one point, I looked around the table and realized something important. Every person present had chosen to be there, not because they needed something, not because they expected something, simply because they valued the relationship. As the evening drew to a close, I stepped outside onto the porch. Snow drifted quietly beneath the streetlights. The neighborhood glowed with holiday decorations. A year earlier, I thought losing a seat at someone else's table was the worst thing that could happen. I was wrong. Sometimes losing your place in the wrong room creates space for you to find the right one. Standing there in the cold winter air, I finally understood the lesson hidden beneath everything that had happened. The greatest gift I received was not justice. It was clarity. Once I understood my own worth, I stopped asking others to define it for me. And that changed everything.